In this scenario, we'll be going over what the differences of a minimum descent altitude is and a decision altitude are, and why they're important to know the different types and these two types of minimums. The scenario we're briefing is a ILS approach with a decision altitude of 200 feet and a localizer altitude of minimum with a minimum descent altitude of at 500 feet. First, we'll need to go over what a decision altitude actually means and what the requirements are for continuing the approach that you're on. A decision altitude is used in precision approaches. The definition of a decision altitude is a specific altitude on a precision approach where a pilot must decide whether to continue the approach or execute a missed approach. DAs are used, as I said earlier, they're used in precision approaches such as an ILS, LPV, or GLS, and other approaches that use vertical guidance for that approach. Sorry. If you have the runway in sight, you can descend below the decision altitude and land. If you do not have the runway in sight, you have to execute the missed approach. You can never descend below a decision altitude without having the runway in sight. Now we need to go over what a minimum descent altitude is to get a better understanding on what the difference is between the two different types of approaches. The definition of an MDA, which is a minimum descent altitude, is the lowest altitude to which is authorized on a non-precision approach until visual reference is established with the runway. MDAs are used in non-precision approaches such as the LOC, VOR, MBD, and LNAV. These approaches do not provide vertical guidance, but they do provide lateral. When you reach the MDA, you may level off, but you may not descend below them without having the runway in sight. There are very critical differences that you need to understand whenever you're making an instrument approach that uses MDAs and or a decision altitude. First difference is the approaches that use them. DAs are used in precision approaches, as said earlier, that have vertical guidance and lateral guidance. MDAs are used in non-precision approaches, which only use the lateral guidance for that approach. If you do not have the runway in sight with a DA, you must execute a missed approach. You can't level off until you have the runway in sight, unlike you can with an MDA. For an MDA, if you do not have the runway in sight, you may level off until you have the runway in sight, if you ever do get the runway in sight. DAs, as said earlier, are used in ILS and LPV approaches. MDAs are used in localizer approaches, VOR approaches, and LNAV approaches. So the big question is, why can you only level off with an MDA? Why can't you level off with a DA? Well, the answer is the MDAs don't have vertical guidance, so the pilot must manually control their descent with under altitude until you have a visual on the runway. This means that if you could end up descending below the below the glide slope and hitting minimums before you should, and that means that if the visibilities are low, you may not have the runway in sight, so you can continue flying until you can see the runway. However, descending below an MDA before having the runway in sight could be catastrophic to the pilot and anyone on board. As the PIC, you must remain disciplined and be patient until you have the runway in sight. There could be very serious and life-threatening and legal consequences if you descend below the MDA or the DA. Consequences could be maybe descending into terrain, and you could crash and lose your life or get very seriously injured. Um, there will also be legal violations under FAR 91-175, which prohibits you from descending below the minimum altitudes that are set in that approach and that you need to have the runway inside it by. The outcomes of doing this could put the pilot and all the passengers on board at risk, so you should never do this. Proverbs 4:26 says, "Give careful thought to the paths for your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways." In aviation, the paths of your feet represents the flight paths and decision points in an approach. Staying disciplined and following these requirements for an instrument approach reflects wisdom, discipline, and also respect for the boundaries that are set for that specific approach. Just as Scripture calls for, steadfast and caution for pilots must remain steadfast in following procedures when they're under pressure. The decision to continue the approach is ultimately up to that pilot, the PIC, so no one can ever force you to continue an approach. Not even ATC or nobody. Nobody can. No passengers. No pressures can force you to continue that approach. So you should always think about your decision you're making whenever you're descending below to go land in an approach. In short, DAs are used in precision approaches, so you must make the decision to continue the approach at that altitude, or you must execute a missed approach. MDAs are non-precision approaches, so you can level off until you have the runway in sight, or execute a missed approach if you never do get the runway in sight by the time you hit that missed approach point. You may never descend below minimums in either of the approaches without having the runway in sight. This ensures that you stay out of danger with the terrain or anything around you, and it also ensures that you're in compliance with FAR 91-175. Having discipline and following the approach minimums is the biblical principles of careful, responsible decision making. These are my references, and thank you for listening to this presentation.